maybe a little heavy on water tonight. That good old sinus season has started, and I've taken something that dried me up, and including my throat. So, all right, tonight we're going to begin looking at apocalyptic literature. I don't know if we will get through all of it tonight. It shouldn't take more than at least a couple of weeks, I wouldn't think, because I don't want us to overwhelm with all the different fundamental characteristics. As long as we kind of learn some of the core principles, we can navigate it, and then as we get into the actual study itself, we can see what's going on and kind of work our way through it and refer back to some of these principles. So, all right, let's begin here. The Bible is filled with different types of literature, okay? That is, the way it is written is different. For an example, one author has suggested that there are 7. There's obviously, as with anything, going to be debate, but he suggested these 7. So you have narrative. Narrative, obviously, is simply telling the story. So like 1st and 2nd Kings that we went through. That would be an example of narrative. Then you have poetry. The book of Job is very poetic in its nature. The Psalms are poetic in their nature. Then you also have the books of wisdom literature. And sometimes the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are all called poetry or wisdom. And that's just a general scope. If you wanted to get technical, you could actually break those up a little bit in more detail. But wisdom literature is something that Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon really are, because they focus on wise sayings, wise counsels about certain things. Then you have parables that are used by Jesus. I'm not exactly sure why this particular individual singles that out, because a parable is, well, anyway, a parable, you're having a story that you're communicating with, and it's not the only one of its kind. A parable is actually a pretty broad, encompassing term, more technically speaking. And then you get the epistle, of course, which is a letter, and you've got different ones of those in the New Testament. You got letters written to churches, letters written to individual people. So the scope of it is different. And then you've got books of prophecy. Now, here's the main thing about prophecy. When you look at the prophetic books, many people, when they hear the word prophecy, their minds automatically run to predicting the future. Okay, I want you to take that definition and hit delete, because that's not what prophetic literature is. Prophetic literature contains future predictions. Primarily, though, prophetic literature is just preaching against the sins of the day for not living up to what the Torah said in Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's really what the greater portion of it is. And a very small portion of it is actually predicting future events. And so we allow that to kind of influence. So when we get to reading different prophets, we're looking at everything they say going, where's the fulfillment? Where's the fulfillment? Well, the fulfillment is the fact that they're lying, stealing, cheating, and committing adultery and coming to worship in the temple. That's the fulfillment. It's not some future thing down the line. It simply is an assessment of the situation, calling them to repent. And then we come to the one we'll spend our time with tonight, and the second half of Daniel is devoted to, and that is apocalyptic. Okay, so when you hear the term, forget biblically for a little bit. When you hear the term apocalyptic, most people would associate with the term apocalyptic end times, right? For a long while, there was a craze in the consumption of media about apocalyptic movies, end times scenarios, okay? Whether it be monsters and zombies and all this kind of stuff in an apocalypse after the normal, some kind of apocalyptic event has ended life as we know it on this planet. And even though there might be some left in the form of a zombie or something, that's what most people usually associate with apocalyptic literature, are things that have to do with end times. Now, I'm going to tell you to do the same thing with that definition I told you to do with prophetic. You're going to have to go click delete and forget that one, okay? Apocalyptic literature is not end times discussion primarily, okay? It's used in both Old and New Testaments. It's used by inspired writers and uninspired writers. So it's doing away with that, and hopefully when we, in just a moment, look at what the word apocalyptic, where it comes from and what it actually means, hopefully that will kind of help us replace that definition with something that is more useful, okay? So, as we think about the term apocalypse, it comes from the Greek term apokalypsis, okay? And it is used in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1, the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. And if you look at the term apocalypsis, okay, so if I'm spelling it out in English, it's the first three letters are A-P-O, okay? In Greek, they're apa. It's a prefix which means away, okay? Like, for an example, if a person goes into apostasy, what are they doing? They're falling away from something. Apa is a prefix that means away from, okay? And then the rest of that term, kalypsis, is just kind of an ending. That's how you tell certain things in Greek. But basically, it means a covering. So when you put the word together, it literally means to take the covering away, okay? To move the covering away. So a lot of people, when they look at apocalypsis or the apocalypse, they think, oh, well, it's mystery. It's hiding in plain sight. No, it's revealing in plain sight, okay? For an example, on game shows, we're going to see what a person has won. Now, obviously, the outline of it gives us an idea of what they've won, but you never know until you actually pull the veil away on it and you can see what it is. The process of removing that covering so you can see what you've won is apocalypsis. It's revealing, it's moving away the veil that's preventing you from seeing what really is. Okay? That is the primary thing that when we deal with apocalyptic literature is getting that definition in our minds. That it is not meant to be hidden from you. It is meant to be shown to you. That's what the very word means, okay? So, the guys at the Bible Project have defined apocalyptic literature this way, and I think they're pretty accurate in their description. And so basically, it's when God pulls back the curtain to show someone what is really going on from a divine perspective. And so it's using wild language as we might see it. How do you really describe a spiritual world to physical people who have no frame of reference? If God were to tell us what heaven really looked like, we'd look at him and be as lost as a goose. Because we have nothing to compare it to. We're physical beings. We've only ever been in a physical world. So, when God is trying to show us, and he's pulling the curtain back, for an example, in the Revelation, what he's doing to the church there is so they're living every day on the ground, seeing the Roman Empire imposing certain things upon them at every level. And it looks like they're overwhelmingly winning, and they're just propagating this. Well, in the Revelation, the apocalypse is where God pulls the veil back for a minute. He shows them, actually, Rome is being fueled by Satan. Satan is at war with God, and God is going to put them down. Okay? That's Revelation in a sentence or two. He's pulling back that curtain to let us see spiritual realities as God sees them. Okay? It's not that Rome is just the most powerful nation on earth. It's actually, Rome's power is not even in itself. Rome's power has been given to them by Satan. Okay? That's Revelation 13, where you got the two beasts that come up out of the water. So, this is, again, I couldn't emphasize this point enough. In apocalyptic literature, we're getting a revelation. We're revealing something. We're showing something. It's not necessarily in a way that we normally would communicate. So, if any of you really like Star Wars or any type of science fiction, apocalyptic literature is going to be easier for you than it is for someone like me. Okay? I got nothing against sci-fi, I just can't understand it. My brain does not operate in that way. Okay? Harry Potter, all those times. I sat down and tried to watch it with someone who's explaining it to me. They're like, this wand, it's magic, and it does this. And I'm like, but why is it magic? And they're like, because it is. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. That's not the way my mind works. Okay? So for me, apocalyptic literature requires a great deal of exertion because that's not the way my brain functions. Okay? For other people, they're very used to that world where you have certain attributes who are exaggerated, where you don't really ask the 8,000 questions of something, you simply accept the statement at face value. Apocalyptic literature will be easier for you because apocalyptic literature is communicating through images. You're supposed to take them at face value. And so, as we walk through this and learning the way the Bible does this and how apocalyptic literature does this, once you understand that, I'm not saying we're ever going to fully understand every single detail along the way, but we're not really going to have a lot of trouble. When we run into a text, we can just simply go through a few things in our head, and we can arrive at 2 or 3 very viable options very quickly as to what the meaning of it is. Okay? All right, any questions or anything on that part before we go forward? All right. Let's talk about the history of apocalyptic literature for a minute. So, apocalyptic literature, it became very prominent. That is the earliest forms that we have of it in ancient sources. It became very prominent around 200 BC and spanned to about 200 AD. Some people, and even Wayne in his the article that I gave last week, he expanded that based on one source out to 1,000. And there is some accuracy to what he is saying there. I'm not challenging that. But that's moving in toward medieval times, and it kind of takes on a different flair. So you're dealing with basically a 400-year window when apocalyptic literature originates and is really at its height. Okay? And you'll notice that it began when you had Jewish people who were in those 400 years of silence. That is, there was no prophet from God. God was not actively communicating with his people anymore. And so, what happens? Well, somebody is going to claim to be one, and they start writing. That's where you get apocryphal books, or as they're known in Catholic circles as deuterocanonicals, because there are certain ones that they accept as inspired and certain ones they do not. Okay? Now, there are inspired apocalyptic works. For an example, the books I'm going to give you. Now, Revelation is an apocalyptic work from beginning to end. It's also prophecy, it's also epistle. But we'll deal with that when we get there, okay? But it is primarily apocalyptic all the way through. Other passages, other books contain apocalyptic, okay? For an example, Isaiah will have apocalyptic images that many times the New Testament will pick up on in its use of apocalyptic literature. Ezekiel will have it. Ezekiel 37 and 38 in particular, the valley of the dry bones is apocalyptic. The prophet Zechariah speaks in apocalyptic language. He begins his book, if I remember right, with just a slew of visions, and they're apocalyptic in their nature. Jesus' discussion in Matthew 24 So, all right, I don't want us to turn into a long discussion, but I do want to mention this because of what's going on in Israel right now and all of the ideas that are floating, okay? All of those ideas, listen, I have political reasons for supporting Israel. I do not have spiritual reasons for supporting Israel, okay? The reason why you hear so many people communicating for Israel, especially religious people, is because of their understanding of apocalyptic literature being end times revelation, okay? And their adherence to dispensational premillennialism is what it is known as, okay? And so basically the message is, and a lot of this comes from Matthew 24, and what I would say is a misunderstanding of Matthew chapter 24, where you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars and signs and all these different things and a pestilence, and these are the signs of the ends of the time. No, they're not. No, they're not. Matthew 24 is apocalyptic in its nature. And he's answering two questions in 24 that spills over into 25. The two questions he's answering have to do with when will be the signs of these things, and in the context, these things that he's just been talking about are the destruction of the temple, which would take place in AD 70 by the Roman Empire. And then from verse 35 forward, all through 25, that's about the second coming of Jesus. And one of the things he shows us in the first part of 24, you can see signs that point to the coming destruction of Jerusalem. But when it comes to the end of the world, there are no signs. Okay? So here's the thing. A lot of people listen, news is theological. As much as it doesn't want to be, news is theological. Okay? It's theologically driven. They just don't know it's theologically driven. Okay? So Matthew 24 is apocalyptic in its nature. Okay? And it's very easily misunderstood because there's a certain section in about verses 28 to 34 where Jesus says you'll see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven coming on the clouds. People say, well, that's got to be second coming. No. No, it doesn't. You see, this is the nature of understanding apocalyptic literature. In Isaiah chapter 19, when God is bringing punishment on Egypt, it says, behold, he is coming on the clouds. It's a common apocalyptic literature metaphor for God's judgment coming upon a nation. That same type of language is used to describe Jesus' second coming, but just because the language is used doesn't mean it's speaking about Jesus' second coming. You have to really wrestle with the context of things that are going on, okay? So, Matthew 24 also, it's in other places. Mark 13, Luke divides it up into two different chapters. I'm not really sure what he was doing there. I mean, I'm sure he had his reasons. I'm not questioning him. I'm just saying it's different. And then you have uninspired apocalyptic literature. For an example, there are 14 uninspired apocalyptic books that are Jewish in nature. There are 14 of those. For an example, you might see the book of Enoch or Enoch. It's an apocalyptic work. There are also 21 Christian versions, that is, people who had adopted Christianity. The Shepherd of Hermas is an example of an apocalyptic work that's not inspired. But that kind of shows you the 200 years before Christ, 200 years after Christ, apocalyptic literature is a common theme. All right. So let's talk then about a few challenges that this type of stuff represents. The first is that we are so far removed historically and in location that it is so different. That is, historically, with Daniel, We're 2,700 years removed. Okay? That's a long time. A lot of stuff has gone down in the last 2,700 years. The world doesn't even resemble what it was 2,700 years ago. So to understand a book that is that old and a message that is that old, we're going to have to do some work to try and get back into their shoes to see what's going on. Okay? Let me illustrate this way. Not the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, but one of the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence. Matter of fact, one of the last ones Jefferson gave, anyway, as it discusses that we have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That last phrase, the pursuit of happiness, originally was penned to read, and the right to own property. Now, if I were to go to an average American on the street and say, the Declaration of Independence promises us life, liberty, and the right to own property, how would they interpret that? A great portion of them would interpret it this way: then the state owes me property. That's not what it meant. Why? We would say that cannot be the right interpretation. Why? Because you're trying to read it as a 21st century American when it was written in the late 1700s. What did they understand about owning property? It had to own property back then in the New World was given to you how? You had to have British approval. It all went through lineage and standing. And so when he said the right to own property, if you ask a person in 1776 what that meant, although it didn't make it into the final draft, they would know exactly what you mean by that. The same thing is true with the books we're dealing with. If we put ourselves in their shoes, it helps us to understand what's going on. And it keeps us from, you see one of the challenges anyway, of reconstructing and going through all those things that are involved. The second one is this. This is actually the hardest part of apocalyptic language, is trying to unlearn and unteach false conceptions that we have been given our whole lives. And I don't mean by that in the church, although they might be there. I mean, we have picked up. We have these notions, for an example, why everybody is running to, and spiritually speaking, saying from the Bible that we should support Israel. Listen, this theory that exists, this dispensational premillennialism, is only about 150 years old, and it was only popularized because it was put inside the Schofield Study Bible that was then mass circulated throughout the United States. Most biblical scholars in the world will tell you premillennialism isn't even close to being true. Now, the great deal of the American Republic, of the American public, accepts premillennialism. And so you hear people on TV, and you hear people talk about blood moons and signs of the times, and they take these little snippets from these phrases and these apocalyptic works, and that's all that people hear. That's all that people know. So you have to unlearn and disassociate things, and that takes time, right? I mean, what was the first thing we talked about? What does apocalyptic mean? What does an apocalypse mean? We have been conditioned to believe that apocalypse means end times. It doesn't. And you don't have to be a genius to figure that part of it out. All you have to do is go look up a word. And so when it comes to learning anything, but especially this, because of the nature of premillennialism, which, by the way, is even deeper rooted in a very not well-known theologian who is the most influential theologian in America, named William Miller, where you have, and from him sprang people like the Seventh-day Adventist group and their focus on prophecy. People like Ben Carson is a Seventh-day Adventist. Okay? I'm telling you, theology is everywhere if you know what you're looking for. And it influences what people believe. It influences foreign policy. It influences all types of things if you know what you're looking for. And it all comes back to, on many occasions, a lot of those things come back to a faulty understanding of apocalyptic literature. So, unlearning is one of the great challenges. Number 3, and this is the greatest danger of them all, and people make it. People have been making it since the beginning. And that is, so when people read the Bible, we say, and rightly so, we say it is from God. It is His message for us today. And so we read it with an eye looking toward what? What is God trying to tell me? What does God want me to know? Well, that's a good thing. But you know, is it true that everything in the Bible God has given to us to communicate to us, and it is for us in a sense? Yes. Is it also true there are things in the Bible that God has given to us that aren't actually for us in a sense? Yes, that's true. Why don't we go and build an ark even though God says, and we have people in America named Noah, why don't they go and build an ark when they read Genesis 6? Because it's not for them. God is not telling them to build an ark. Okay? So you have to watch that very closely. And I'm not saying that Genesis 6 doesn't have anything to teach us. I'm saying it would be wrong for me to go to Genesis 6 and say, my name is Noah, therefore I need to build this boat because a flood is coming. It's not written to me that way. And we have to understand that. And so if you study the history of interpretation with all of these apocalyptic books, like Revelation and Zechariah and Isaiah and Daniel, every generation, every one of them, they've all tried to say that it was something that was some kind of a problem in their day. Last century, it was the creation of the European Union. Centuries before that, it was the Pope. And before that, depending upon which locale you're in, it's usually whichever government head is in charge of your particular government where you live at that point on the face of the earth. Because we have this tendency to want to take this and say, God is talking directly to me and giving me an end times playbook. God is not giving us an end times playbook. God doesn't care that we know what happens. God cares that we are ready for it to happen. And that's what a lot of people can't get. If you look at all of the discussion of second coming, and apocalyptic literature is involved in some of the second coming imagery, if you look at it, God is not saying, okay, now I want y'all to come here, because I'm fixing to show you exactly how the world is going to end and exactly how everything is going to play out step by step. He simply says, like in 2 Peter chapter 3, I'm going to destroy this world, and seeing that all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct? If this world is going to end and you're going to be judged, then maybe you should think about how you're living. Not debating whether the earth will be incinerated or renovated or destroyed and then recreated again. That's not the point that he's trying to communicate. The those are some of our challenges. And I've got an eye on the clock, and it says I still got a minute or two, so we're going to go forward a little bit. So these are some characteristics of apocalyptic literature. One is they are historically significant. That is, if you look at when they are written or when the revelations are actually given, it is usually connected to a significant historical moment for the people of God. For an example, Daniel and the Jews are in captivity, right? Their whole world has crashed, and now they're in captivity wondering what's going to happen. So God communicates to them. Revelation is the same way. They're facing difficulty of how to balance living in the world but not being of the world, and how to deal with the Roman imperialistic ideas. And so he communicates to them, all right? So there's a historical setting that must be explored. The second is that there is a use of visions, okay? Now here is where one of the ways where prophecy and apocalyptic are different. In prophecies, God is many times, as best as it can be understood, God is speaking to the prophet. Now, what that looks like, I have no idea. It seems as though God is speaking directly to the prophet, and the prophet is then communicating what he is hearing through words. An apocalypse is completely different. Okay, so an apocalypse and a vision, think of it more like interactive theater. Okay? That is, you go from room to room and place to place, and actors and different things are changing. You're interacting with things. So for an example, in Daniel 7, which will be the first area that we interact with, it will start with the sea being tempestuous and 4 beasts rising up out of the sea. Okay? And so he'll talk a little bit about that, and then all of a sudden in verse 9, he jerks our attention away from those beasts, and he points us to heaven and says, there is a throne set in heaven, and here's the Ancient of Days sitting down. You see how we're being pulled? I'll show you this, but then I'm going to jerk you over here. You're going to watch a play, but it's going to be progressive. I'm going to let you see what happens in this room, and I'm going to let you see it, and then I'm going to whisk you to the next room to catch the next scene, and to the next room to catch the next scene. It's interactive, okay? We'll do this one because it doesn't take hardly any time, and it's pretty self-obvious. It's dramatic in its scope. The images are wild. It's meant to arrest you, right? So you see beasts with 10 horns and 7 heads and crowns, and then you've got a peculiar horn that comes out, and 3 horns are plucked up and they're replaced by a bigger horn. All these types of things start taking place. And so it's very dramatic in order to get people's attention, but also you remember that. Now, if I told you, if I came in here and I said, okay, here are the 3 Roman emperors that are represented, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, short-reigned, and then they are displaced by Vespasian. I guarantee you by next week you couldn't tell me any of the 4. Unless you wrote it down, I almost guarantee it. And that's nothing against you. But if you saw me bring an animal in here, and this animal had 3 horns on his head, and while I was talking to you, I broke one and said Galba, and then Otho, and then Vitellius, and I broke their horns, and then I took a horn that I had created, and I stabbed it into its head. Be a little more memorable. You may not be able to tell me the guys' names anymore, but you've at least got a scenario that you're working with that you can pull from. Okay? So that's why we're dealing with dramatic effects, because it imprints it on us deeply. Okay? All right. Went just a little over. Any questions or anything before we're done. If not, if you do have them, I'll take them individually here. But yeah, we're done.